The Henry Borel case, mother and stepfather, accused of torturing and murdering a 4-year-old child. Chapter 1. The Innocent Smile that broke a nation's heart. Henry Borel Medeiros was only 4 years old when his life was brutally cut short in March 2021. But his innocent smile and tragic story would forever change Brazil's understanding of domestic violence and child abuse. The little boy with curly hair and bright eyes lived in a luxury apartment in Barra da Tijuca, one of Rio de Janeiro's most affluent neighborhoods, where the sounds of children playing should have echoed through marble hallways instead of the silence that would soon follow his death. On the surface, Henry appeared to live a privileged life. His mother, Monique Medeiros da Costa e Silva, was a successful teacher and education professional who had built a respectable career in Rio's academic circles. His stepfather, Dr. Jairo Souza Santos Jr., was a prominent city councilman and former federal deputy, a man whose political ambitions and public image seemed to promise a bright future for the family he had joined. But behind the closed doors of apartment 302, in the luxury majestic condominium, a different reality was unfolding. The same hands that Henry reached for in trust were the ones that would ultimately destroy him. The case would expose the horrifying truth that monsters don't always lurk in dark alleys. Sometimes they live in our homes, wear expensive suits, and hide behind respectable facades. The story of Henry Borel became more than just another tragic case of child abuse. It became a symbol of systemic failures, of how society's most vulnerable members can be failed by the very institutions designed to protect them. The case would spark nationwide protests, legislative changes, and a painful examination of how domestic violence affects children who cannot speak for themselves. When the truth finally emerged, it would reveal a pattern of systematic torture disguised as discipline, a mother's betrayal of her most sacred duty, and a political figure's abuse of power that extended far beyond the public sphere. The luxury apartment that should have been Henry's sanctuary became his prison, and the adults who should have protected him became his executioners. The investigation that followed would uncover evidence so disturbing that even seasoned detectives struggled to maintain their composure. And the trial would captivate Brazil as the nation grappled with the unthinkable reality of what had happened to an innocent child, whose only crime was being born into the wrong family. Chapter 2. The Making of a Monster's Den. Henry Borel's short life began with promise and love. Born on February 14, 2017, he was the son of Leniel Borel de Almeida, an engineer who adored his boy, and Monique Medeiros, who initially appeared to be a devoted mother. The early years of Henry's life were marked by the typical joys and challenges of any young family, with his father documenting every milestone and his mother sharing in the celebration of their son's development. However, the family dynamic changed dramatically when Monique began her relationship with Dr. Jairo Souza Santos Jr. in 2019. Jairo was a man accustomed to power and control, having served as a federal deputy and later as a Rio de Janeiro city councilman. His political career was built on a carefully crafted image of family values and social responsibility, making him a respected figure in conservative political circles. The relationship between Monique and Jairo developed quickly, and soon they were living together in the upscale Barra da Tijuca neighborhood. For Henry, this meant adapting to a new father figure, a new home, and new rules that would gradually become more oppressive and dangerous. What began as typical step-family adjustments would evolve into a nightmare of systematic abuse and control. Jairo's approach to child-rearing was rooted in authoritarian principles that he disguised as discipline and character building. He believed that children needed to be toughened up and that modern parenting was too permissive. This philosophy, combined with his need for absolute control in all aspects of his life, created a toxic environment where Henry's natural childhood behaviors were seen as defiance that needed to be crushed. Monique, who had once been a protective and loving mother, began to change under Jairo's influence. Friends and family members later testified that she became increasingly distant from Henry, more focused on pleasing her new partner than protecting her son. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. The woman, who had once celebrated every one of Henry's achievements, was now viewing him as an obstacle to her relationship with a powerful man. The luxury apartment in the majestic condominium became a prison where Henry's movements were monitored, his behavior scrutinized, and his childhood gradually stripped away. Neighbors would later report hearing strange sounds from the apartment, crying, shouting, and impacts that they initially dismissed as typical family noise, but which would later be revealed as evidence of systematic torture. The psychological dynamics in the household were complex and disturbing. Jairo used his political connections and social status to create an environment where questioning his methods was unthinkable. While Monique found herself caught between her maternal instincts and her desire to maintain her relationship with a man who promised security and social advancement. Chapter 3. The escalation of terror. As 2020 progressed and the COVID-19 pandemic forced families into lockdown, the abuse in the majestic apartment intensified dramatically. The isolation that was meant to protect families from disease became a cover for escalating violence against Henry, who found himself trapped with his abusers 24 hours a day with no escape or outside intervention. Jairo's discipline methods became increasingly violent and systematic. What he called education was actually a carefully orchestrated campaign of physical and psychological torture designed to break Henry's spirit and establish absolute control. The 4-year-old boy was subjected to beatings, forced physical exercises, and psychological manipulation that would have been considered torture if applied to an adult prisoner of war. The abuse followed a predictable pattern that experts recognize in cases of systematic child torture. Henry would be accused of minor infractions, spilling food, making noise, or simply acting like a normal 4-year-old child, and then subjected to punishments that were wildly disproportionate to his alleged offenses. These punishments were designed not just to hurt Henry physically, but to destroy his sense of safety and trust in the adults who were supposed to protect him. Monique's role in the abuse was particularly disturbing because it represented a complete betrayal of the maternal bond. Instead of protecting her son, she became complicit in his torture, either actively participating in the abuse or standing by while Jairo brutalized the child. Her transformation from protective mother to enabler of abuse was complete, driven by her desire to maintain her relationship with Jairo at any cost. The psychological impact on Henry was devastating. Neighbors and building staff later reported that the once cheerful child had become withdrawn and fearful, flinching when adults approached him and showing signs of severe emotional distress. His natural curiosity and joy had been systematically crushed, replaced by a constant state of fear and hypervigilance that no child should ever experience. If you're following this heartbreaking story, please hit the like button and share it with others who need to understand the reality of child abuse in our society. Awareness is the first step toward prevention. The abuse was not limited to physical violence. Henry was subjected to psychological torture that included isolation, humiliation, and threats that kept him in a constant state of terror. He was forced to endure punishments that lasted for hours, designed to break his will and establish Jairo's absolute dominance over every aspect of his young life. Medical records that would later be examined during the investigation showed a pattern of injuries that should have raised red flags among healthcare professionals. However, the family's social status and Jairo's political connections created an environment where questions were rarely asked and explanations were readily accepted, allowing the abuse to continue unchecked. Chapter 4. The Night That Changed Everything. March 8, 2021, began like any other day in the majestic apartment, but it would end with Henry Borel's life hanging in the balance and a chain of events that would expose one of Brazil's most shocking cases of child abuse. The day was marked by the same oppressive atmosphere that had characterized Henry's life for months, with Jairo's controlling presence dominating every aspect of the household routine. According to the timeline later reconstructed by investigators, the fatal assault on Henry began in the evening hours when the 4-year-old allegedly committed some minor infraction that triggered Jairo's rage. What followed was not a momentary loss of control, but a sustained and brutal attack that would prove fatal to the small child who had already endured months of systematic abuse. The violence that night was particularly savage, involving multiple impacts to Henry's head and body that caused internal injuries incompatible with life. Forensic experts would later determine that the force required to cause such injuries could only have been delivered by an adult with the intention to cause serious harm. The attack was not a single blow delivered in anger, but a sustained assault that continued even as Henry's small body showed signs of severe trauma. Monique's actions during this critical period would become a central focus of the investigation. Instead of immediately seeking medical help for her gravely injured son, she participated in a cover-up that delayed potentially life-saving treatment. The precious minutes and hours that could have made the difference between life and death were wasted on constructing lies and attempting to conceal evidence of the abuse the couple's behavior. In the hours following, the assault revealed their priorities with chilling clarity. Instead of rushing Henry to the hospital, they spent time cleaning the apartment, disposing of evidence, and coordinating their stories. Their primary concern was not the life of a dying child, but protecting themselves from the consequences of their actions. When they finally arrived at the Barra Dure hospital in the early morning hours of March 8th, Henry was in critical condition with severe head trauma and multiple internal injuries. The medical staff immediately recognized that the child's injuries were inconsistent with the explanation provided by his parents, who claimed he had fallen from his bed during the night. Dr. Claudio Tadeo Cardoso, the pediatric intensivist who treated Henry, later testified that the child's injuries were clearly the result of severe physical abuse, not an accidental fall. The pattern and severity of the trauma indicated multiple impacts delivered with significant force, and the delay in seeking medical treatment had severely compromised Henry's chances of survival. Despite the heroic efforts of the medical team, Henry's injuries were too severe to overcome. He was declared brain dead on March 11, 2021, 3 days after the assault that ended his short life. His death certificate would list the cause as traumatic brain injury resulting from child abuse, officially confirming what medical professionals had suspected from the moment he arrived at the hospital. Chapter 5. A Nation's Outrage and Awakening. The news of Henry Borel's death sent shockwaves through Brazilian society that reverberated far beyond Rio de Janeiro's borders. When the details of his abuse became public, the nation was forced to confront the horrifying reality that a 4-year-old child had been systematically tortured and murdered by the very people who should have protected him. The case became a catalyst for national soul-searching about child protection, domestic violence, and the failures of institutions designed to safeguard society's most vulnerable. Members' social media exploded with outrage and grief as Brazilians shared Henry's photos and demanded justice for the innocent child whose life had been so brutally cut short. The hashtag Justiça por Henry, Justice for Henry, trended nationwide, with millions of people expressing their horror at the details of the case and their determination to ensure that his death would not be in vain. The public's anger was particularly focused on the fact that Jairo Souza, Santos Jr. was a sitting city councilman who had built his political career on family values and social responsibility. The hypocrisy of a man who publicly advocated for children's welfare while privately torturing a 4-year-old child was too much for many Brazilians to comprehend. Protests erupted outside the Rio de Janeiro City Council, demanding Jairo's immediate removal from office and prosecution to the fullest extent of the law. Monique's role in the abuse sparked equally intense outrage, as the public struggled to understand how a mother could participate in the torture and murder of her own child. The betrayal of the maternal bond, considered sacred in Brazilian culture, added an extra layer of horror to an already unthinkable crime. Women's rights groups and child protection advocates used the case to highlight the complex dynamics of domestic violence and how abusers often manipulate their victims into becoming complicit in their crimes. The case also exposed serious failures in Brazil's child protection system. Despite clear signs of abuse, no intervention had occurred to protect Henry from his tormentors. Teachers, healthcare providers, and social services had all failed to recognize or act upon the warning signs that should have triggered protective measures. The system, designed to safeguard children, had failed catastrophically, allowing a 4-year-old boy to be tortured to death in plain sight. Media coverage of the case was extensive and emotional, with television networks dedicating hours of programming to analyzing every aspect of Henry's short life and tragic death. Journalists interviewed child protection experts, psychologists, and legal professionals, all trying to understand how such a horrific crime could have occurred and what could be done to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The case became a turning point in Brazilian discussions about child abuse and domestic violence. Legislative proposals were introduced to strengthen child protection laws, improve training for professionals who work with children, and create better reporting mechanisms for suspected abuse. Henry's death, while tragic, became a catalyst for systemic changes designed to protect other children from similar fates. Religious leaders across Brazil also spoke out about the case, with many using their platforms to condemn child abuse and call for greater vigilance in protecting vulnerable children. The Catholic Church, Protestant denominations, and other faith communities united in their condemnation of Henry's killers and their call for justice and systemic reform. Chapter 6. The investigation unfolds. The investigation into Henry Borel's death was led by Detective Henrique Damasceno of Rio de Janeiro's Homicide Division, a veteran investigator with over 15 years of experience in complex criminal cases. From the moment he arrived at the Barrador Hospital and saw Henry's injuries, Damasceno knew he was dealing with one of the most serious cases of child abuse he had ever encountered. The detective's first priority was securing and analyzing the crime scene at the Majestic apartment. What investigators found there painted a disturbing picture of systematic abuse and a hastily organized cover-up. Blood evidence, despite attempts to clean it, told the story of the violent assault that had claimed Henry's life. Forensic experts were able to reconstruct the events of that fatal night, revealing the true extent of the violence inflicted upon the 4-year-old child. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the immediate crime scene as detectives sought to understand the full scope of the abuse Henry had endured. They interviewed neighbors, building staff, teachers, and healthcare providers, gradually building a comprehensive picture of the systematic torture that had characterized the final months of Henry's life. Each interview revealed new details about the child's suffering and the adults who had failed to protect him. Technology played a crucial role in the investigation as forensic experts analyzed cell phone records, security camera footage, and digital communications between Monique and Jairo. These digital breadcrumbs revealed the couple's attempts to coordinate their stories and cover up evidence of their crimes. Text messages between the two showed a callous disregard for Henry's welfare and a primary concern with protecting themselves from legal consequences. The medical evidence was particularly damning. Dr. Claudio Tadeo Cardoso and other medical professionals who had treated Henry provided detailed testimony about the child's injuries and their inconsistency with the explanations provided by his parents. Forensic pathologists conducted extensive examinations that revealed not only the fatal injuries from the final assault, but also evidence of previous abuse that had gone unreported and untreated. One of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation was the discovery of how the couple had manipulated Henry's medical care to conceal evidence of abuse. They had taken him to different hospitals and clinics for various injuries, ensuring that no single healthcare provider saw the full pattern of abuse. This calculated approach to concealing their crimes demonstrated the premeditated nature of their actions and their awareness of the criminal nature of their behavior. The investigation also revealed the role that Jairo's political connections had played in protecting the family from scrutiny. His status as a city councilman had created an environment where questions were rarely asked and explanations were readily accepted. This abuse of political privilege added another layer of outrage to an already horrific case and highlighted the need for systemic reforms to prevent powerful individuals from using their positions to conceal criminal behavior. Detective Damasceno and his team worked tirelessly to build an airtight case against Henry's killers. They knew that the public was watching and that justice for Henry depended on their ability to present compelling evidence that would lead to convictions. The investigation consumed months of intensive work, with every piece of evidence carefully analyzed and every witness thoroughly interviewed. Share this story to help ensure that Henry's case leads to real changes in how we protect children from abuse. Awareness and action are the only ways to prevent future tragedies. Chapter 7. The Arrests and Legal Proceedings. On April 8, 2021, exactly 1 month after Henry's death, Rio de Janeiro, police executed arrest warrants for both Monique Medeiros and Dr. Jairo Souza Santos Jr. The arrests were carried out simultaneously to prevent any coordination between the suspects and were broadcast live on television as millions of Brazilians watched. The two people responsible for Henry's death being taken into custody. Jairo's arrest was particularly dramatic as he was taken from his city council office in handcuffs while conducting official business. The image of the powerful politician being led away by police officers became an iconic symbol of justice finally being served for Henry. His political career, built on promises of family values and social responsibility, came to an abrupt and ignominious end as he faced charges of torture and murder of a child. Monique's arrest was equally significant, as it represented society's recognition that maternal bonds do not excuse participation in child abuse. Her booking photo, showing a woman who appeared more concerned with her own fate than grief over her son's death, became a symbol of the ultimate betrayal of parental responsibility. The public's reaction to her arrest was particularly intense, as many struggled to understand how a mother could participate in the torture and murder of her own child. The charges against both defendants were severe and comprehensive. They faced accusations of torture, murder, and child abuse, with prosecutors seeking the maximum penalties allowed under Brazilian law. The torture charges were particularly significant, as they carried enhanced penalties and reflected the systematic nature of the abuse Henry had endured during the final months of his life. The legal proceedings were complicated by the high-profile nature of the case and the intense public interest in seeing justice served for Henry. Both defendants hired prominent criminal defense attorneys who immediately began challenging the evidence and attempting to shift blame away from their clients. The defense strategies revealed the callous nature of the accused, as they showed more concern with avoiding punishment than expressing remorse for their actions. Jairo's defense team attempted to portray him as a loving stepfather who had been wrongly accused of crimes he did not commit. They argued that Henry's injuries could have been caused by accidents or medical conditions, despite overwhelming forensic evidence to the contrary. This strategy was met with public outrage and skepticism from legal experts who recognized the overwhelming evidence of systematic abuse. Monique's defense was equally problematic, as her attorneys attempted to portray her as another victim of Jairinho's abuse, who had been coerced into participating in the crimes against her son. While domestic violence experts acknowledged that abusers often manipulate their victims into complicity, the evidence in Henry's case suggested that Monique had been an active participant in the abuse, rather than a reluctant accomplice. The pre-trial proceedings were marked by numerous attempts by the defense to suppress evidence, challenge witness testimony, and delay the trial. These tactics were seen by the public as attempts to escape justice and only served to increase the pressure on the judicial system to ensure that Henry's killers faced appropriate consequences for their crimes. Judge Elizabeth Machado Luro, who presided over the case, faced intense pressure to ensure that justice was served while maintaining the integrity of the legal process. Her decisions regarding evidence, witness testimony, and trial procedures were scrutinized by legal experts and the public alike, as everyone recognized that this case would set important precedents for future child abuse prosecutions. Chapter 8. The Trial That Gripped Brazil. The trial of Monique Medeiros and Dr. Jairo Souza Santos Jr. began on October 3, 2022, in a Rio de Janeiro courthouse that had been transformed into a fortress due to intense public interest and security concerns. The proceedings were broadcast live on television, allowing millions of Brazilians to witness the pursuit of justice for Henry Borel firsthand. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and members of Henry's extended family, all seeking to see his killers held accountable for their crimes. The prosecution, led by prosecutor Fabio Vieira, presented a methodical and devastating case that laid bare the systematic torture Henry had endured during the final months of his life. Using medical evidence, forensic analysis, and witness testimony, Vieira painted a picture of two adults who had conspired to torture and ultimately murder an innocent child, whose only crime was being born into the wrong family. The medical testimony was particularly powerful and disturbing. Dr. Claudio Tadeu Cardoso, who had treated Henry at the hospital, described the child's injuries in detail, explaining how they were consistent with severe physical abuse rather than accidental trauma. His testimony was accompanied by medical images and reports that showed the full extent of Henry's suffering, leaving many in the courtroom visibly shaken. Forensic experts testified about the evidence found at the crime scene, including blood patterns that revealed the violence of the final assault and attempts by the defendants to clean up evidence of their crimes. The scientific evidence was overwhelming and painted a clear picture of premeditated violence followed by a calculated cover-up designed to avoid responsibility. The most emotional moments of the trial came when Henry's father, Henry Borel, testified about his son's life and the changes he had observed in the child during his final months. His testimony about Henry's transformation from a happy, outgoing child to a fearful, withdrawn boy provided crucial context for understanding the psychological impact of the abuse. Lenniel's grief was palpable as he described his last conversations with his son and his regrets about not being able to protect him. Jairo's defense team attempted to portray their client as a loving stepfather who had been wrongly accused of crimes he did not commit. They presented character witnesses who testified about his work in politics and his public advocacy for children's rights. However, this strategy backfired as it only highlighted the hypocrisy of a man who publicly championed children's welfare while privately torturing a 4-year-old child. The defense also attempted to suggest that Henry's injuries could have been caused by medical conditions or accidents, bringing in expert witnesses to challenge the prosecution's forensic evidence. These attempts were largely unsuccessful, as the overwhelming scientific evidence clearly indicated that Henry had been the victim of systematic physical abuse that culminated in his murder. Monique's defense strategy was equally problematic, as her attorneys attempted to portray her as another victim of Jairo's abuse who'd been coerced into participating in the crimes against her son. They presented evidence of the controlling nature of her relationship with Jairo and suggested that she had been too afraid to protect Henry from his abuse. However, the prosecution countered with evidence showing that Monique had been an active participant in the abuse and had prioritized her relationship with Jairo over her son's welfare. The trial was marked by several dramatic moments, including the presentation of audio recordings and text messages between the defendants that revealed their callous attitudes toward Henry and their primary concern with avoiding legal consequences for their actions. These communications showed a complete lack of remorse or concern for the child they had killed, further damaging their credibility with the jury. Chapter 9. The Psychology of Child Killers. To understand how two adults could systematically torture and murder a 4-year-old child, forensic psychologists and criminal behavior experts analyzed the psychological profiles of Monique Medeiros and Dr. Jairo Souza Santos Jr. Their findings revealed disturbing patterns of behavior that provided insight into the minds of individuals capable of committing such heinous crimes against an innocent child. Dr. Jairo's psychological profile revealed characteristics consistent with narcissistic personality disorder combined with psychopathic traits that made him particularly dangerous to vulnerable individuals like Henry. His need for absolute control and his inability to tolerate any form of resistance or independence created a toxic environment where a normal 4-year-old's behavior was perceived as defiance that needed to be crushed through violence. The political career that Jairo had built was itself a manifestation of his narcissistic tendencies and his need for power and recognition. His public advocacy for family values and children's rights was not genuine concern, but rather a calculated strategy to build his political brand while concealing his true nature. The hypocrisy of his public persona versus his private behavior was a classic example of how psychopathic individuals can manipulate public perception while engaging in horrific crimes behind closed doors. Jairo's approach to disciplining Henry was not about education or character building, despite his claims to the contrary. Psychological analysis revealed that his actions were motivated by a need to dominate and control, with the violence escalating as Henry's natural childhood behaviors triggered his rage. The systematic nature of the abuse indicated careful planning and deliberate cruelty rather than momentary losses of control. Monique's psychological profile was more complex, as she appeared to have undergone a dramatic transformation from protective mother to accomplice in her son's murder. Experts identified patterns consistent with dependent personality disorder and trauma bonding that made her susceptible to Jairo's manipulation and control. However, this psychological vulnerability did not excuse her participation in Henry's abuse or her failure to protect him from harm. The relationship between Monique and Jairo exhibited classic characteristics of an abusive dynamic, where the abuser gradually isolates the victim from support systems and manipulates them into complicity with increasingly serious crimes. Jairo's political status and social connections provided additional leverage that he used to maintain control over Monique and prevent her from seeking help or leaving the relationship. Psychology experts who studied Henry's case noted that the abuse he endured would have had devastating effects on his psychological development and sense of safety. The fact that his primary caregivers were also his tormentors created a particularly traumatic situation where the child had no safe haven or source of comfort. This type of betrayal trauma is among the most damaging forms of child abuse and often results in severe long-term psychological consequences. The case also highlighted the phenomenon of family annihilation, psychology, where individuals who feel their control or status is threatened may resort to extreme violence against family members. While Henry's murder was not technically a family annihilation, the psychological dynamics were similar, with Jairo viewing the child as a threat to his relationship with Monique and his carefully constructed public image. If you're interested in understanding more about the psychology behind these horrific crimes, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analyses of criminal behavior and the minds of those who commit unthinkable acts. Forensic psychologists also examined the role that social status and privilege played in enabling the abuse to continue unchecked. Jairo's political connections created an environment where his behavior was rarely questioned, and his status provided a shield that protected him from scrutiny. This abuse of privilege is a common factor in cases where powerful individuals commit crimes against vulnerable victims. Chapter 10. Justice, Legacy, and the Questions That Remain. On December 16, 2022, after months of testimony and deliberation, the jury delivered their verdict in the case that had captivated Brazil and broken the hearts of millions. Dr. Jairo Souza Santos, Jr. was found guilty of torture and murder and sentenced to 33 years and 2 months in prison, while Monique Medeiros was convicted of the same charges and sentenced to 24 years and 8 months. The sentences represented the maximum penalties allowed under Brazilian law and were met with relief and satisfaction by those who had followed Henry's case. The convictions were seen as a victory for justice and a vindication of the Brazilian legal system's ability to hold powerful individuals accountable for their crimes. However, the sentences could never truly compensate for the loss of Henry's life or heal the wounds inflicted on those who loved him. The little boy, who should have been celebrating his 6th birthday, was gone forever, his potential unfulfilled and his future stolen by the very people who should have protected him. Henry's father, Henry Borel, emerged from the trial as a powerful advocate for child protection and domestic violence prevention. His dignity and strength throughout the legal proceedings inspired many Brazilians and helped keep focus on the need for systemic changes to protect vulnerable children. He established the Henry Borel Foundation, dedicated to preventing child abuse and supporting families affected by domestic violence. The case led to significant legislative changes in Brazil, including the passage of Henry's Law, which strengthened penalties for child abuse and improved training for professionals who work with children. The law also created better reporting mechanisms for suspected abuse and enhanced protections for children in domestic violence situations. While these changes came too late to save Henry, they represent his lasting legacy and may help protect other children from similar fates. The investigation and trial also exposed serious flaws in Brazil's child protection system that allowed Henry's abuse to continue unchecked despite clear warning signs. Healthcare providers, educators, and social services all failed to recognize or act upon evidence of abuse, highlighting the need for better training and more robust intervention protocols. The systemic failures that contributed to Henry's death became a catalyst for comprehensive reforms designed to prevent similar tragedies. The case had a profound impact on Brazilian society's understanding of domestic violence and child abuse. It shattered the myth that abuse only occurs in poor families and demonstrated that wealth, education, and social status do not prevent individuals from committing horrific crimes against children. The public's reaction to the case showed a growing awareness of the need to protect vulnerable children, regardless of their family's social standing. Religious and community leaders across Brazil used Henry's case to promote greater vigilance in protecting children and to encourage reporting of suspected abuse. The case became a rallying cry for child protection advocates and helped break down some of the cultural barriers that had previously prevented people from intervening in suspected abuse situations. The psychological impact of the case extended far beyond Henry's immediate family, affecting everyone who followed the story and learned about the systematic torture he had endured. Mental health professionals reported increased demand for counseling services as people struggled to process the horror of what had happened to an innocent child. The case forced many Brazilians to confront uncomfortable truths about the prevalence of child abuse in their society. Despite the convictions and the legislative changes that followed, questions remain about how such a horrific crime could have occurred in plain sight without intervention. The failure of multiple systems and individuals to protect Henry highlights the ongoing challenges in preventing child abuse and the need for continued vigilance and reform. Henry Borel's story serves as a permanent reminder that children are among society's most vulnerable members and that protecting them requires the active participation of every citizen. His death was a tragedy that should never have occurred, but his legacy lives on in the laws, policies, and awareness campaigns that bear his name and work to protect other children from similar fates. The luxury apartment in Barra da Tijuca where Henry died has been sold, but the memory of what happened there will forever haunt those who knew his story. The building's residents and the broader community continue to grapple with the knowledge that such evil existed in their midst, hidden behind closed doors and respectable facades. As Brazil continues to process the lessons of Henry's case, his memory serves as both a source of grief and a catalyst for positive change. The little boy who suffered so much in his short life has become a symbol of the need to protect all children and to never again allow such systematic abuse to occur without intervention. If this story intrigued you, subscribe to the channel to discover other real crimes that shocked the world and the minds behind them.